I'm so excited to welcome you all to the Writers Center's virtual craft chat series, where we talk with writers a little less about what they wrote and a little more about how they wrote it. My name is Emily Holland, and I'm thrilled to have Lamya H joining us as tonight's guest in celebration of their memoir, Hijab Butch Blues. Lamya, would you be able to read us a short excerpt just to kick the event off and give folks a little taste of how the book is structured?
Yeah. Thank you so much for inviting me to do this event. I'm really excited. I've been doing sort of a lot of interviews and podcasts that are, about the book as opposed to about the writing of the book. So I'm so excited to be talking about that. I'm going to be reading a short excerpt right now. And it's from the first chapter of my book, which is titled Maryam, which is it's the Muslim version of the Virgin Mary. And in this section, I am 14 and encountering the chapter about Maryam in the Quran for the first time, really, in Quran class in school. In the country that I live in the Middle East, I'm at this sort of all-girls Islamic school, and we're reading parts of this chapter together in class. Today is a review lesson, the Quran teacher tells us, to prep for our midterm the week after. I'm devastated. I'll have to wait an entire week to know what happens next while we recap the 30 or so verses we've already read, and then review the recitation, the hard words, and the English translation for our upcoming test. Someone in the front row starts reading the beginning of the surah aloud, and I sigh, slip into my usual half-listening mode. I nudge my best friend sitting next to me and ask to borrow her multicolored pens for doodling. Then someone reads the translation of these verses aloud. And mention in the book the story of Maryam when she withdrew from her family to a place toward the east, and she took in seclusion from them a screen. Then we sent to her our angel, and he represented himself to her as a well-proportioned man. She said, "Indeed, I seek refuge in the most merciful from you, so leave me if you should be fearing of Allah." He said, "I'm only the messenger of your Lord to give you news of a pure boy, Isa." She said, "How can I have a boy while no man has touched me?" I stopped doodling, stopped calculating how many minutes till the end of class, stopped thinking about the bag of chips in my backpack, stopped breathing for a second, my body caught in a moment of clarity that shoots through me and suspends my thoughts. Suddenly, my arm raises of its own accord, and before I'm aware of making any conscious decision, I'm speaking, my voice higher than usual and breathless. Miss, did Maryam say that no man has touched her because she didn't like men?" There is a pause, 2 seconds of shocked silence before my classmates break into titters. Some roll their eyes. This sounds a lot like one of my infamous questions that derail the class, and some of my classmates are annoyed that I've interrupted their get-out-of-jail-free summary of the classes they've skipped and the things they need to know for the midterm. But I'm grateful, so grateful for the tittering. It conceals my earnestness. I'm grateful for my earlier antics that I get to play off this question as a moment of clowning instead of a sincere, burning desire for an answer. I need to know, is this a thing? Are there other women like me who don't like men, who would tell a handsome, well-proportioned man angel who appeared before them to go away, who have never been touched by men, who don't want to be touched by men? The Quran teacher, a matronly Sudanese woman in her 60s who has always been kind to me, doesn't seem to read anything into my question, and mercifully, she does not skip a beat in her answer. "No," she says, "it's because Maryam had taqwa. She had God consciousness in its highest state of being. It's because Maryam was pious and loved and feared God. She knew that the divine was watching her, even if no one else was around, knew that the presence of God was everywhere, even if she couldn't see God. Maryam didn't want the privacy of her situation to tempt her into doing something with this beautiful man, something God wouldn't be happy with. Isn't that an excellent lesson to learn, girls? Don't ever forget that God is watching. When you're around boys, God is always watching. If you're alone with a boy, God is watching. If it's just the two of you somewhere, then God is the third. Remember Maryam, girls. Maryam turned to God. She asked the man to go away because she had taqwa. But I know differently. Maryam is a dyke. Isn't it obvious? Doesn't it make sense? She lives alone in a mosque with no one else around, no one to monitor what she does or whom she meets up with, and not a person in the world for company. One day, a handsome and well-proportioned man comes to her door unannounced. No one will know if he stays a while. No one will know what they do together. But before he can even talk, Maryam asks him to leave. No, thank you, she says. Please don't talk to me. She would rather have her solitude than the company of this handsome man. Eventually, she lets him stay, but only because he says he's an angel. She hears him out because he's an emissary from God, laughs heartily when he says she's going to have a baby. Who, me? She says. No man has ever touched me. No man. And I know she was pious. I know she was always aware that God was watching, but there's no hesitation, not even for a second, when she turns him down and bars him from her space. It must be because Maryam doesn't like men. Not handsome ones, not well-proportioned ones. These things don't even register for her. No man has ever touched her, she said. She hasn't let them. She hasn't been interested. Maryam is a dyke. Or maybe she isn't. Who knows? Dyke isn't even a part of my vocabulary at 14. And maybe I'm reading too much into this story, these few lines of a text that's been around for 1400 years. But what I do know is this. Maryam is something, somehow like me. I feel different that day after Quran class. Relieved at first, after the embarrassment dies down, after I'm done playing off the question as intentional, after I'm done receiving high fives in the hallways from my classmates for my joke. I'm relieved that no one has caught on, and I'm relieved that I'm not the only one like this. And after this relief comes elation. There are other women like me in the Quran, women who are uninterested in men, who are born wrong, living lives that are entirely out of their control.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much for reading that excerpt. I think it touches upon a lot of the things that we'll talk about on the craft level in the memoir too. So I'm really, really glad that we got to hear that to start us off. Would you be able to tell us a little bit about who you are before we really dive into our questions today?
Yeah, I am a queer Muslim, non-binary womanish person living in New York. I'm 37 years old. I was born in a country in South Asia, and then we moved, me, my mom, my dad, and my brother, we moved to the Middle East where I grew up. And then I moved to the US for college. And this memoir is basically about those various displacements and those identities and my current life here in the US.
Wonderful. Thank you. All right, so let's start with our first question, which some folks consider the most difficult one, which is why we always send the questions ahead of time to give you some time to maybe think on this one. So what is something that you have not been asked about your work that you would like to talk about, or maybe put in a different way, what's something that you notice within your work or you do consciously within your work that no one has brought up yet?
This is such a hard question. And it's also hard because not only do I have to ask the question, but I also have to answer it. So I thought a lot about it. And one of the things that I guess I've been really surprised that no one has really asked me and that I haven't had a chance to talk about is sort of this question of why write a memoir in the first place? I think it's fairly recently that people of color, that non-celebrities and non sort of old white men have been writing about themselves. And I think that there's something really powerful in our stories being sort of worthy of the genre. So I've just been really excited by all of the really groundbreaking memoirs that have come out in the past, I would say 10 to 15 years. So I knew that I really wanted to write into that genre. And then the other reason is that I think it's easy to sort of call your work fiction or autobiographical fiction because that ends up creating a sort of distance from it and a sort of plausible deniability. But I really wanted to write this in ways that felt really honest and vulnerable. And and partially the reason that I was able to do that is because I wrote under a pseudonym. But I really wanted to call it a memoir for those reasons, just mostly for the sake of sort of like honesty and intimacy. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I love that. I also love the emphasis on sort of what stories are allowed to take up space in that genre, right? And I think storytelling is so integral to this memoir in particular, and sort of staking a claim for a particular story feels very meaningful and poignant, and definitely something this book is doing that is exciting to see as well. So great. Well, to move on from that one, now that we've got the hard one out of the way, I want to first talk about something that really stood out to me as a queer reader, which was how you sort of crafted queerness into something that felt sacred or holy alongside these stories that you're pulling from the Quran and other Islamic teachings. I think you create a narrative that's so expansive in identity, queer identity, but also religious identity, as we move through the memoir, which is really exciting and kind of fun to see on the page. So I'm wondering if you could talk about like the planning process for the memoir itself, that sort of conceptualization of what stories you're putting side by side to your personal narrative and how you sort of conceptualize those movements across the chapters or individual essays.
Yeah. So actually, the first essay that I wrote as part of this memoir actually it's the second or the third last essay. It's the one about Hajar, and it came about kind of by chance. I was visiting my family with my partner on Eid, and me and my partner were pretending to be friends because I wasn't out to my family, but I really, really wanted her to be able to meet all these people that I had been telling her about for so long. And so I was thinking a lot about the story around that Eid. The story is mostly told through the vantage point of Ibrahim, also known as Abraham, and this dream that he has in which he sees God asking him to sacrifice his son. And the story goes that, he gets ready to do it, and, and then God replaces his son Ismail with a sheep, and it's a sheep that gets slaughtered, and then there's a big feast. But what I was thinking a lot during that visit was about Hajar, who is Ismail's mother, and sort of like her sacrifice in letting all of this happen. She was also exiled along with Ismail because Ibrahim's other wife, Sarah, was jealous. And so I was just like thinking a lot about like her sacrifice and the sacrifices sort of like by my partner and me in going to visit my family, and the sort of like both the deep joy that the sacrifices made possible and that sadness. And I was thinking about Hajar too, and sort of the joys and the sadness she must have felt. And so that essay sort of came about from that visit. I write because there's something that feels like it's tangled in my head, and I write to sort of like explore the problem from various angles and to really sort out my feelings. And I started writing, and as I was writing about me and my partner, I found myself also writing about Hajar, and so that sort of intertwined essay came around. And when I was done writing that, it almost felt like the other essays like kind of just wrote themselves, because I had been thinking about all these stories about these figures in the Quran for so long, and I had always been sort of like questioning their motivations, or like thinking of them as like, deeply flawed, deeply human people with like internal narratives. And so I found that a lot of the other essays sort of just like came about because they had always sort of been there. And so then I wrote maybe like 4 or 5 and had this moment where I was like, wait, this actually has a story arc. And then I went back and sort of like looked at where that story arc was and what parts were missing, what things I wanted to flesh out and talk about. Yeah, so that's how the sort of like writing and mapping of the memoir happened. I'm not a writer by training. I know that there are a lot of people who do, MFAs or like take writing classes in high school or college, and that was never me. It's just, it's just not how schooling is set up where I came from. And so I had to like really learn I had to teach myself how to write a larger project, because I had written essays before, and those are different because they're so tight. You're trying to make a point, and you sort of like write about the vignettes and memories that come up that directly support that point. But with something like this, I had to really think through what the recurring characters were, the way that I was moving through time. So yeah, I really had to sort of like think through those things and teach myself how to do that.
Yeah. I'm glad that you brought up some of those things, because I know like different repetitions in the chapters that sort of we're moving in a narrative time, but it's not a linear narrative. So we're touching at similar points in time through different stories and different lenses. And I loved being able to feel that familiar touch when we were like, okay, we're going back to age 14 now, and we're in a different place, but we're still, we're embodying that version of the narrator here. And so could you maybe talk about how you embraced that nonlinear aspect of the structure, how you maybe thought about organizing the stories themselves to give that arc that we see from beginning to end, but also that variation that makes the telling of it pretty exciting.
Yeah. So, I mean, memory is not linear. And so when I was writing, I definitely knew I wanted to write something that sort of like moved through time and space, kind of in the ways that memory does. But what was really hard for me was learning to give my reader enough context cues so that they would know exactly where they were, both geographically, because I moved around so much, but also chronologically, what has happened so far and what hasn't happened so far. So it was a process of like learning how to do that, just like being able to like orient my reader, and then also just like trusting my reader that if I give them, like, I don't have to like spell out everything all the time, that I can give them just sort of like enough context cues. And, even if they don't remember exactly where the character is, they'll at least be able to absorb enough from the story to orient themselves.
Yeah. So important that trust your reader. I think all of us as writers forget that sometimes, and we're like, but wait, we need to give them more. We need to give them more. But sometimes we've given them enough to carry the story through, which is great.
Right. And readers are smart.
Yeah. Yes, they are. Sometimes I feel like readers are smarter than I will ever be. So to stay a little bit on this idea of structure, I felt like the memoir embraced sort of a queering of the unexpected narrative, even in the narrative itself, right? The way that maybe you as the narrator are coming up against the expectations that are held for, what it means to be, the right gay, right? Or the right type of Muslim, right? The right type of practicing within this religion, but also sort of what it means to have the right type of memoir structure, and sort of pushing up against that. So I wonder if it ever came into mind as you were building the collection of these essays, sort of embracing this almost queer nature of storytelling and subverting reader expectations, and maybe if you leaned into that at all, or how you maybe embraced that.
So it's so interesting that you say that, because when I was in my like sort of early 20s and looking for just like all the queer literature that I could find, I don't know if people remember sort of like the early 2000s and how hard it was to find just LGBTQ literature. I remember a lot of the narratives then were just so they were so sort of like there was just like one story, and that one story was that, this is how you're gay, you tell your parents, everyone cries, and then everyone like hugs, and and then you tell the world, and then like it gets better. I remember when like Dan Savage's campaign was happening, and I don't know, sometimes it felt like there were just no other narratives out there, which is really interesting, because the more like queer people I met, and the more sort of like queer Muslims, especially, I met, I don't know, everyone had such like rich lives that were very different from this like one narrative. And so to me, I wanted to write a book that pushed back against that. But and that also just like didn't use this sort of like coming out as like a pinnacle sort of moment. My book is like full of comings out, the way that life is. And I really wanted to write something that was beyond that. Like, what happens after you come out? How do you find your people? How do you figure out how to live? I really leaned into this idea of sort of like multiple stories, multiple narratives, and just different ways of living.
I feel like the parts of the story when we were really seeing those variations on coming out, and the ways that it doesn't always fit those expectations, right? Those movie versions of what we think, and even the ways that sometimes you can't come out to protect yourself and protect your personal life and your inner life in different ways. I love that the stories were really embracing that, and also the use of the phrase, right, inviting in rather than coming out. That really stuck with me as well.
I remember the first time I encountered that. I think Darnell Moore has like a bunch of really beautiful essays that I can link in the chat afterwards, about this concept. But I remember encountering that in my like early 20s and just being like, where has this been my whole life? Like, why isn't this like one of the narratives that, that gets told? Why is it always about this idea of coming out as opposed to inviting people into this like circle of trust?
It was really a poignant moment. I was like frantically going through and highlighting all these different things in my copy. So really lovely to get to those different moments and sort of feel the transformation of maybe you as the narrator throughout as well. To talk a little bit more about stories and sort of storytelling, there's so many instances of the narrator telling their experience or someone telling a story to them, sort of retelling different experiences in different ways. So we get all these different variations and sometimes slight repetitions of different stories. So I'm wondering how you sort of leaned in and gave yourself that freedom when returning to or transforming stories that have been told or written down or studied, so many times. How did you embrace that act of creativity when you were crafting the essays?
I think all storytelling is an act of sort of like translation and interpretation, which even sort of like choosing which, parts to emphasize, which parts to sort of like go quickly over, which parts to sort of like really like slow down and take your time with and think about, or even like what becomes like like if you're telling a story, like what is the punchline? What is the point? So to me, it felt really natural to do that with stories from the Quran as well. And also, like I said, I didn't grow up sort of like writing a lot, but I did grow up reading a lot. I would, like, as a reader, I would always have questions about the characters that I was reading. Like, what are they feeling? Why did they do that and not this other thing? Why were they sort of like anxious, scared, etc.? And so to me, it felt pretty natural to do that with these stories from the Quran as well. How did Moses feel the first time that God was talking to him? Like, he must have been like scared, or what was that experience like? It felt really great to sort of like allow myself sort of like freedom with that. And I think what really helped with that was just this realization that, every time you tell a story, it's an act of translation and interpretation. And why not sort of like think of these stories in really queer ways? I don't know. And the other thing that I was surprised by was like how much empathy I had for all of these like prophetic figures as I was retelling their stories. Sometimes it can be, really easy to think of them as like saints in some way, as like people who just like never do wrong. But at the end of the day, they were all human and just like deeply human. And I don't know. There have definitely been instances where I was like, well, Jonah, why did he walk away from his community? And like, of course he got swallowed by a whale. Like he like walked away. But just like really thinking through these stories and in like talking about them and writing about them, it gave me a lot of empathy for these characters.
Yeah. Almost like that level of attention brings you closer to them in some way.
Yeah. And also, when you have that much empathy for a character, it also lets you extend that empathy to yourself, which was really interesting to me. I can be really hard on myself, but like going back and reflecting on some of these situations that I found myself in and like really thinking of them through the lens of these prophets and their feelings, it really helped me sort of like have empathy for myself in those situations as well.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's so important too when we're writing material that's so close to the self. I mean, of course, you don't want to give yourself a hall pass, but you also don't want to be so hard on yourself that then it becomes maybe more painful to do the work than it needs to be. Yeah, I love that kind of interplay between the stories and the self, which we see in the way the book is structured too, which was lovely. I'm wondering if there were any stories that you were working with that didn't make the final cut of the book, anything that you were trying to make work that just wasn't ready or didn't quite fit. I'm primarily a poet, and we always have, those B-sides to the manuscripts that don't make it in. So I'm wondering if there was something similar for you.
I feel like that is such a poet question. Actually, no, I had the opposite experience where I, wrote the whole thing. And then my editor was like, a few months before we were supposed to submit the final manuscript, my editor was like, hey, have you thought about sort of like writing something that like really directly addresses, why you're writing under a pseudonym. And that's where the last chapter in the book, the chapter about sort of like Eunice, also known as Jonah and the whale, that's where that came from. I'm definitely one of those people who when you'd be assigned like a paper in college and it was supposed to be 5 to 7 pages, mine were always 4. And, I'd like make the margins bigger. And so, I definitely had like no B-sides, but I definitely added stuff in the editing process, including a whole entire essay.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I feel maybe some of that tightness of language that is connecting me to the poetic as well, that maybe leads to that sort of concise nature too, of maybe those college papers that were too short. But I think the book it feels very tight, and really every story there is doing a lot of different work, and the interactions between each essay, I think were really great. Just kind of looking back as a whole after you finish is really lovely. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about your publishing experience, just maybe going from that initial essay to the memoir itself, since we brought up a little bit of maybe adding things during that editing process. How did that work for you? And I know you've written essays and things for different venues too, so I'm wondering how this project was maybe different than sort of the publishing aspect for those other pieces.
Well, I really honestly, I kind of lucked into everything. I connected with an agent on Twitter, and she was one who was like, hey, have you thought about writing a book? And, initially I was like, no, what, me? I write essays. They're, 800 to 1200 words. Like, the idea of writing something like long feels so out of my wheelhouse. And then I started working on, one essay, and it kind of grew from there. And then the pandemic happened, and suddenly I had, just like time and space to write in ways that I had just like never had in my life before. I actually like have a job that has to be done in person. And so we were shut down for about like 2 months. And in those 2 months, like when I say I've never had this kind of time and space before, like I really couldn't even have imagined it. And just like having time and space, like just really changed everything. And I found that I could really sort of like think through and focus on my writing. And most of the book happened then. And then the publishing experience was really great too. My agent is amazing. Her name is Julia Carden. If anyone is looking for someone for representation, definitely query her, because she's absolutely brilliant. She was really sort of like thoughtful about who to reach out to in terms of submissions. I definitely got a lot of no's from people who just like didn't understand the work and just weren't quite positioned to really work with me, I guess. But my editor at Dial is just really, really amazing. And it felt like she really, really got the book. She's also queer and a person of color. And it felt like it was so cool to be in this position where someone was reading my writing so thoughtfully and so holistically, like not just in terms of the words, but also in terms of the larger story structure. So I think honestly, the editing process was one of my favorites. Writing is just hard. And, I always like having written as opposed to like the process of writing. But editing was like definitely the most fun part of everything, because she really brought a thoughtfulness to the project. And I just really enjoyed that experience. It was also really interesting because, at some level, it's like, this is my life. And so when she was making comments, like, it sounds like the narrator is scared over here. And I was just like, yeah, wow, that is a read. Or I think there was a point at which she was like, it seems like the narrator is really afraid to be vulnerable in this moment. And I was like, oh my God, yeah, that's wow. So yeah, I really, really enjoyed the editing process.
Yeah. It's sometimes funny how editors can see us before we can really see ourselves on the page. We're like, oh, yeah, that is what's happening. Thank you for spotting that. And then we have that work, right, to go back and sort of work our way through those emotions that maybe were holding us back.
They're like writing therapists.
And we need them.
Yeah.
Thank goodness for editors. All right. I do just want to remind folks in the event that please throw your questions into the chat. I have plenty, but I would love to ask yours as well. So I'll keep an eye on how that chat is going. And I'll go back to some of my questions. Talking a little bit about just the writing process in general. Do you have like a daily writing practice, or now that the book is out, do you have any other things that you're working towards or consistently working on in different ways to sort of, I don't know, stretch that writing muscle?
I wish I had a daily writing practice. For me, like writing feels like almost like a crush. Like, you get so sort of like obsessed with this idea, or, like I was talking about earlier, this like tangle, that all I want to do is I want to, spend time with it. I'll be, thinking about it as I'm walking to the subway or taking a shower. And, so yeah, and then like I'll find myself devoting all like any free time I have to it. And then, it kind of comes down, and then I have sort of the next thing that I want to explore in my tangled head. I wish I had a writing daily practice. I hear those are amazing for those who are able to have those. In terms of what I'm working on now, I'm in the very beginning stages of writing a book that is fiction. It's my first time writing fiction, which I'm really excited about because I read a lot of fiction, and it's always felt like this, like, I don't know, this like really like cool, unattainable thing, but I'm working hard on learning how to write it, and learning how to sort of like conceptualize it. Like, how do you come up with characters? How do you think through their backstories, their motivations, where they would want to end up in life, where you would want them to end up in life. So I'm working on a project about sort of like creative resistance in the Middle East, in the community that I grew up in, but like very much at the beginning stages of conceptualizing characters and thinking through storylines.
Yeah, no, that's exciting. And it seems like maybe this memoir sort of primed you to move into that fictional space just by nature of sort of reimagining or retranslating some of the stories from the Quran in different ways too. So yeah, that's exciting. Can't wait to see that on the shelf in some point in the future. And I want to go back to something that we kind of talked about a little bit with earlier, I think maybe with the answer to the first question, but just the embracing or trying to get at that element of truth within the story, that kind of honesty there, and those possibilities that we have when we put our stories to the page. And I'm wondering if there was anything that you felt was holding you back as you approached the project, and how did you overcome those feelings, or maybe even literal barriers to craft the essays?
I think writing under a pseudonym really opened up the space for me to be really honest. And I think if I wasn't writing under a pseudonym, I would have like really felt like I had to hold back. So that definitely helped a lot. There were parts of the experience that made me, surprisingly sad. Like, I don't know, it felt like because I've written about the place, the country where I'm from, and the country that I lived in under my non-pseudonym name, it felt like I couldn't talk about those. So that made me really sad because there's a richness of detail there that felt like was missing. But in general, sort of like writing under a pseudonym was just really freeing. And then it's really interesting because, when you're writing, it's just like such a solitary endeavor. Like, it's just you and a page. And I kind of forgot that people read it. And not just, people that you don't know, but also people that like your friends, some of which are mentioned, in your writing. So that I'm kind of glad that I forgot about that, because it felt like, I definitely would have felt a lot more, I guess, I don't know, maybe like embarrassed or shy if I had remembered those things, but not remembering that meant that I kind of like wrote, without abandon, and dealt with that later.
Yeah, that's so important too, because I think if we approach the page with, readers or audience in mind, sometimes that holds us back, that prevents us from doing the work that we really need to be doing. And I think in every essay here, you can feel just all of those truths and how honest the narrator is approaching everything, even while sort of learning themselves along the way. I think that ties into that level of honesty within the voice as well. Let me pop into the chat. I think we have a few questions around the same thing, so maybe I'll try to combine them. A couple questions wondering about like reader reaction, anything that surprised you or encouraged you in reaction to the book, and maybe how do you manage the pressure of sort of having this book about being queer, being Muslim, that maybe spokesperson element to having the story out there now?
What's been really lovely is that I've gotten a lot of messages on social media from people who are queer and Muslim or Muslimish, or queer and of faith, and just being like, I don't know, that where my work really resonated for them. So that's been really, really, really lovely. When I've written essays in the past, I have gotten like some, mean comments. So I've learned not to read things that are negative and to just really not engage with them. It's been really encouraging, and I've been trying to sort of like stay away from the negativity, which, I'm sure there's negativity out there, because I am saying things that are surprising or disorienting for people, but I'm trying to stay away from them. And that's been an exercise in sort of like learning to draw boundaries, which has been useful, not just in terms of the book, but just also in terms of life.
Yeah, maybe ties into that, protect yourself, protect your space. Don't read the Goodreads comments, right? All those things that we're told when we publish things. But yeah, I'm glad that there's been sort of an outpouring of identification with the stories, because I too felt very connected to so much of the book. So that was really great. Let me see what else is going on in here. Bob is asking a question just about story arc. So why did you decide to write the multiple essays rather than that overarching story? I know we talked a little bit about that nonlinear narrative, but was that choice related to what you wanted the reader to take away, or sort of maybe difficulties organizing the themes of the book going through?
For me, part of it was that I had written essays in the past, and it was, what I knew how to write. But a big part of it was also just sort of like drawing parallels and trusting the reader to make connections. And I found that I could do that when I was sort of like grouping the parallels together. And so a lot of the chapters are sort of like trying to make a particular point or about one particular thing. And a reason, the big reason for that is just sort of like allowing my reader to sort of like draw conclusions for themselves instead of having it in disparate places in the book and sort of like having to remind the reader.
Yeah, I like that sort of, you were talking about doing that untangling work to get to the page, but now the reader is sort of doing that, moving through following those threads in different ways too. And yeah, I think that's important too. Definitely going back to that, trust your reader, trust your reader to follow. Let me see, where else are we? Another question just about the publishing aspect, maybe, overall, how long was the process from writing the book to getting it published? And Pam is wondering about how you found that editing process fun. I think that's many of us, we don't like that process. So.
Pam, I really appreciate the double question mark in that. So I wrote my first essay that's part of this book in 2018, and I finished writing it in, I think, 2020, towards the end of 2020. / beginning of 2021. And then it took about 2 years from going out on submission to having to sort of like to having the book out there in the world. Yeah, I think I found it fun because it felt like the hardest part, aka the actual writing, was over, and it felt like I had like the scaffolding in place, and then I was just doing the sort of like aesthetic details as opposed to sort of like building something from the ground up. And I think that's also just like a reflection of my personality. I really like the sort of like fiddling and tinkering much more than the like bigger picture building. And so I found that I really enjoyed it because it let me work things on the level of like words and sentences, and then like it also like allowed me to sort of like step back and look at the whole thing as a whole. And the other thing that I really enjoyed was having someone to bounce ideas off of. I feel like writing can be so solitary that you can forget that there are people who will read your work. And it was so cool to have an editor who was so attentive to my work and who had read it so thoughtfully, and to be able to sort of just like bounce ideas, talk through things, talk about organization or the points that I was trying to make. Being able to do all of that with an attentive reader was really, really cool. And it was something unlike anything that I had experienced before, honestly. I have worked with editors in the past, but the editors have mostly, again, they've been mostly for essays. So we're talking about much shorter writing. But it was really cool to sort of like work through something that existed on different tiers and levels, and have someone like just so thoughtfully be reading it alongside me.
Yeah, that's so important to not only have a good editor, but one that is all in with the project and there to help you make it what you want it to be and not sort of transform it into something that it's not. So important. And you mentioned sort of that tinkering on the level of sentences, and something that I really noticed in the book was just the level of sounds and musicality, imagery and repetition, all these sort of maybe poetic elements that I also connected a little bit to this element of prayer in some ways. So how do you go about, doing that work, maybe constructing those sentences with that eye or ear towards something poetic or those sounds? Is that something that's there in those first drafts, or do you really go through and refine some of those movements in revision?
First of all, thank you for saying that, because I feel like I read poetry and I'm like, oh my God, how do people do this? It's so beautiful, and you can sort of like hear it and watch it move on a page. And I'm always just so enthralled at how people are able to write like that. For me, I think the repetition, the repetition is sort of like just how I write and how I make sense of things. And again, allows me to draw parallels. And I actually do it so much that a lot of the editor comments were like, repetition, please consider changing. So I actually had to go back and take a lot of it out, which again, like, I think because I had such a great editor, I think it actually like helped the book without losing my voice. So it's definitely like something that is part of how I write. But I do have to sometimes like go back and read, and sometimes like sort of read things aloud, just to make sure it works, and that the sort of like that the cadence is what I want it to be, as opposed to sort of like as opposed to being very sort of like heavy-handed and not subtle. So I find reading aloud, and I know this is a thing that people talk about a lot, but I find reading aloud just very, very helpful.
Yeah, so important at all stages of writing. Wonderful. I wanted to get to this question before we sort of lean into our last question, but the title, Hijab Butch Blues, very much connected to Leslie Feinberg's Stone Butch Blues novel, which is a novel that I love and is such a foundational queer text. So I'm wondering if you could mention or throw out any writers that influence you or influence this book in particular, and maybe who you return to for inspiration or guidance while you're writing or doing this work.
Leslie Feinberg is definitely just a huge inspiration. I remember reading Stone Butch Blues I think I read it in my late 20s, and it blew my mind in terms of writing something that is both incredibly personal, but also deeply political. And it's definitely something that I wanted to do in my book too, just, write about these like memories and like these sort of like stories of my life, but also tie it to bigger structures like race and gender and sexuality and class and sort of like geography and movement. I love Stone Butch Blues for how effortlessly intersectional it is, and found myself very, very inspired by it. Other writers that sort of like similarly blew my mind when I read them were just Audre Lorde, whose work is just so phenomenal. And I don't think I could have been the person I am without having read her work in my 20s, and just like having that be a foundational part of who I grew into as a person. And then in terms of sort of like just writing more in the genre of memoir, I love Dorothy Allison's work. It's just so beautifully written and so deeply feeling it's another one that I come back to over and over.
Wonderful. Yeah, that gives everyone some good names to put on their reading list for after the chat. Great. Well, as we're kind of getting to the end of our time here, our last question is always sort of, some takeaways. So what advice would you give to a writer who's just starting to put their story to the page, or just starting to maybe explore memoir as an avenue for storytelling?
I think one of the best pieces of advice I've ever gotten is my writer friend once told me to start tracking my rejections, which honestly changed how I approach submitting. I got really competitive about it, as one does. But I don't know, there's something about sort of like the tracking of your rejections that makes the acceptances like even more meaningful. And also it's just a reminder at the end of the year, when you sort of like reflect back at how many places you submitted to, that, you took your work seriously and you put it out there, and, it didn't end up everywhere where you wanted it to be, but you tried. And it also made me more confident in submitting to places that were huge reaches, and places that I would never have thought to consider otherwise. So yeah, I that's the best advice that I've gotten. And, it's something that I wish I could tell everyone who writes.
Yeah, it's so hard, right, to open ourselves up to rejection, but even that simple reframing of rejections as, proof that you're doing the work and you're getting it out there and you're trying, can make them sting a little less, I think. Wonderful. Well, Lamya, thank you so much for your time and for your words. Everyone, please pick up a copy of Hijab Butch Blues. We'll have a link to purchase in the chat, but we also really encourage you to purchase from your local bookseller, local independent bookstore, rent it from the library, all the things, write reviews on Goodreads, spread the word for the book. It's really an amazing memoir and super meaningful. And I hope that you all can connect to the stories as much as I did. So thank you, Lamya. It was wonderful to hear more about the creation of the stories.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.